The ocean is not silent, it whispers with the voices of the drowned. Beneath the glimmer of moonlight, waves conceal secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. For centuries, cruise ships have sailed across these vast waters, symbols of luxury, escape, and adventure. But behind the laughter, the music, and the shimmering lights lie stories that will freeze your blood. Stories of passengers who vanished without a trace, of cabins that seemed alive with unseen hands, of ships swallowed whole by something far darker than storms. Tonight, we open the black book of the sea. This is 11 most disturbing true cruise ship horror stories. If you dare to drift deeper into the abyss, remember to subscribe to Moonlit Fears, because some nightmares are best shared in the dark. The sea has always held a fascination for humanity, a realm of beauty, freedom, and endless horizons. But for those who spend their lives sailing across its depths, there is another truth. The ocean is patient and merciless. It watches, it waits, and when the moment is right, it takes. On a crisp autumn evening, a vessel known as the Seraphine set out from port. Towering and immaculate, the cruise ship was a marvel of modern design, gleaming white decks, endless corridors, bars spilling with music, theaters glowing with light. To the outside world it was nothing short of paradise afloat. Inside, passengers danced, drank, and celebrated, their voices carried into the night like sparks cast upon the waves. But paradise is a fragile illusion. Beneath its polished veneer, the ship carried shadows, and within its steel hull was a man who would never leave it again. His name was Daniel. Daniel was, by all accounts, an ordinary passenger. Early 40s, well-dressed, reserved. He kept to himself, though not in an unfriendly way. He was the kind of man you might notice once in passing, and then never think of again. He traveled alone. No wife, no children, just one ticket booked under his name. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. He ate his meals in silence, sipped red wine in the lounge, and walked the decks at night with a cigarette in hand. Staff remembered him politely, though they would later say there was a distant quality about him, as though he were not fully present, as though the ocean had already begun to whisper to him. It was on the third night when everything changed. The evening had been filled with laughter and noise. The ballroom glowed with music, couples dancing in rhythm as champagne glasses clinked under chandelier. But while the revelry carried on below, Daniel was elsewhere. He wandered to the upper deck, an empty stretch of steel and railing that looked out into the blackness of the sea. Witnesses, few as they were, described him standing there for a long time, longer than seemed natural. The wind was sharp, cutting, and yet he did not move. His hands rested on the cold railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He swayed gently, back and forth, not with the rhythm of the waves, but as if something unseen tugged at him. Then, nothing. By dawn, Daniel was gone. When the steward entered his cabin, they found it untouched. The bed was neatly made. His suitcase sat in the corner, clothes carefully folded, shoes aligned in perfect pairs. His passport and wallet remained locked in the drawer, untouched. There was no sign of panic, no hint of escape, only absence. The announcement came quietly over the intercom later that morning. A missing passenger. Crew were instructed to search every level, every corner of the ship. They moved with urgency, radios buzzing with static as reports came in. The dining halls, the theaters, the lower maintenance decks. Nothing. Daniel had vanished as though he had never been there at all. The ship's security footage was pulled, its many cameras spanning nearly every inch of the vessel. It should have told the story clearly, but when they reached the footage of the upper deck where Daniel was last seen, the image warped. Static bled across the screen, obscuring the final moments. 1 second he stood there, leaning against the railing. The next, the picture dissolved into nothingness. No fall, no body, just absence. The crew gave their official explanation: an accident. They claimed he must have gone overboard, whether by misstep or intent. It was easier than admitting the truth they did not want to confront, easier than explaining why there had been no splash, no scream, no alarm, easier than admitting the sea had taken him, without a sound. Passengers whispered among themselves, whispers that grew darker with every passing night. Some claimed to hear footsteps pacing outside their cabins, long after midnight. Footsteps that stopped when investigated, leaving only silence. Others spoke of seeing a figure on the deck in the rain, staring outward with hands clutched to the railing, pale and unmoving. The cabin Daniel once occupied had to be locked. The cleaning crew refused to enter after the first attempt. They told of lights flickering as they cleaned, of sheets pulled taut by invisible hands, of the faint sound of choking filling the air, as though lungs gasped for breath underwater, though the room was bone dry. The ship pressed onward. The laughter of parties grew thinner. Passengers avoided the upper deck at night, though some swore they could see him there still, his outline faint beneath the moonlight, watching, waiting. One woman spoke of looking over the railing and seeing a face in the water below. The ship was moving swiftly, the waves frothing white, and yet the face was clear, pale, with hollow eyes and lips parted in silence. It did not sink beneath the water. It did not drift away. It followed the ship, its gaze fixed upward, unblinking. Others dismissed it as hysteria, as rumor feeding itself into nightmare. But deep down, every passenger knew this was no ordinary disappearance. The sea had claimed him, and when the sea takes, it does not return what it has swallowed. But sometimes it lingers. Days passed, yet the shadow of Daniel's disappearance never loosened its grip on the ship. What had begun as hushed whispers among passengers soon became an unshakable weight in the air, pressing against every deck, every cabin, every uneasy silence between the walls. The Seraphine carried on through the black waters, its lights glowing faintly against the endless night, but joy was gone. Laughter no longer rang with freedom. It sounded forced, brittle, a mask stretched too thin over fear. And though the staff worked tirelessly to keep the illusion of paradise afloat, dread had taken root in the heart of the vessel. It began subtly. Passengers waking in the middle of the night, claiming they heard someone breathing in the dark. The sound came from corners of their cabins where no one stood, soft and steady, like lungs filling with salt water and straining to release it. Some ignored it, others prayed through it, but the next night it always returned. Then came the cold. Entire hallways seemed to shiver, the air dropping sharply in temperature without reason. The ship's heating systems worked without fail, yet some stretches of corridor felt like winter's hand had touched them, freezing the breath in every throat. The strange part was that these cold zones always appeared near Daniel's locked cabin. The crew grew uneasy. The cabin was avoided altogether. Doors that had once been polished daily were now left to gather dust, as though touching the handle itself carried risk. One steward admitted that the night after Daniel vanished, she tried to sleep inside the locked room, to prove her courage. By morning she was gone from her post, never seen on the ship again. Her name, like Daniel's, was swiftly erased from record. The official story: she had disembarked at the last port, but passengers knew better. Whispers grew louder. Some claimed that when the ship sailed through particularly still waters, they could hear knocking, faint but deliberate, rising from the hull below, as if someone were trapped deep beneath the surface. The rhythm was uneven, desperate. Those who pressed their ears to the steel swore they could feel vibrations run through their skulls, like the heartbeat of a man suspended somewhere between life and drowning. The upper deck, once a haven for stargazers, became a place of dread. Few dared to wander there after sundown. Those who did returned pale and shaken, speaking of a figure leaning over the railing. Sometimes it stood still, other times it swayed back and forth, mirroring the ship's movement. The most terrifying reports came from those who dared to look closer. They said the figure was soaked through, water dripping endlessly from its clothing, yet the surface beneath it remained dry, and always its face was turned away, until the very last second, when hollow, drowned eyes locked with theirs. Not everyone survived the encounter. One passenger, a young man emboldened by drink, laughed at the rumors, and swore he would confront whatever specter haunted the deck. Witnesses saw him climb the stairs, his laughter echoing into the night. Moments later, screams tore through the stillness. By the time others rushed to the deck, it was empty. Only his shoes remained, neatly placed by the railing, as though he had stepped out of them before vanishing. No splash had been heard. No ripples disturbed the sea. The captain attempted to maintain control, insisting these were coincidences, exaggerations born of fear, but his voice wavered, and his eyes betrayed the truth. He too had seen some. He too had heard the whispers in the halls, the dragging footsteps that trailed him when no one walked behind. As the voyage stretched on, the ship seemed to grow heavier, as if weighed down by unseen hands clinging to its hull. Machinery malfunctioned more often. Lights flickered even in calm seas. Passengers fell ill, their dreams plagued with visions of water filling their rooms, of lungs collapsing under invisible pressure. And through it all Daniel remained. His absence had become a presence impossible to deny. On the final night of the voyage, when land was almost in sight, a storm rose suddenly from the horizon. Waves lashed against the ship with fury, but the weather was not what froze passengers in terror. For as lightning split the sky, dozens of faces were seen in the water below, pale, sunken, staring. Not just Daniel but others, passengers from years past, perhaps decades, their mouths opening soundlessly beneath the surface. The realization settled like ice in every heart. Daniel was not the first. The sea had taken many before him, and it would take many again. The Seraphine limped back to port, scarred by more than weather. Passengers disembarked quickly, eager to leave behind a ship that felt less like a vessel of leisure and more like a tomb adrift. The cruise line buried the reports, silenced the whispers, and scrubbed the records clean. But not everything could be erased. To this day, crew members refuse to speak of cabin 623, the room that once belonged to Daniel. They say it remains locked on every voyage, untouched, collecting dust with every passing year. Some claim that if you stand outside it long enough, you'll hear the faint sound of water dripping, and others say you can hear breathing, as though someone somewhere in that dark room is still struggling for air. And if you lean over the railing of the Seraphine on a still night, and let the black waves pass beneath you, you may see him, Daniel, his eyes wide, unblinking, staring up through the water, waiting for the next passenger who dares stand too close to the edge. The sea is patient, the sea is merciless, and once it chooses you, there is no escape. Every ship carries secrets. Some are whispered about among the crew, others hidden in maintenance logs, quietly erased before reaching port. But among the darkest of these secrets are the cabins that no passenger is ever assigned. On every voyage these rooms remain shut tight, their numbers missing from the booking system, their doors sealed as though the ship itself refuses to let them breathe. On the Celestia Maris, one such cabin existed. Its brass number plate was tarnished, dulled by years of salt air, and while every other room bustled with life, luggage dragged across carpets, laughter spilling from balconies, this one stood silent, locked, always locked. The crew called it Cabin 73. For most passengers, it was invisible. They walked past it without notice, absorbed in their own journeys. But for those who lingered, those who slowed their steps down certain hallways, they would feel it, a heaviness, subtle at first, like the press of unseen eyes against their skin, the kind of weight that made the air thicker, the light dimmer, as though one step closer to that door was one step deeper into something that wanted them. The cabin's story was never part of the brochure, never mentioned on the guided tours, but rumors travel faster than truth at sea. Crew whispered of its past late at night, when duty gave way to fatigue and silence. They said the room had once belonged to a family, 2 parents, a daughter of 12, and a boy of 7. On the ship's maiden voyage, the family never reached the first port. The cabin was found in disarray, luggage torn open, sheets shredded, the mirror cracked in a web of fractures. But of the family, there was nothing. No bodies, no screams reported, no signs of forced entry, just absence, as though the sea had crept into the room and swallowed them whole. From that day forward, cabin 73 was sealed. Yet sealing a wound does not stop infection. Decades later, the cabin's reputation had grown. Stewards sent to inspect it during renovations refused to stay inside for longer than a few minutes. They spoke of the air cold, heavy, tasting faintly of rust and salt. Others mentioned faint sounds, a child's laugh, echoing faintly through the floor, or the muffled creak of footsteps pacing the length of the room. One carpenter swore he saw damp handprints smeared across the inside of the door as though someone had pressed desperately to get out. Still, the cruise line could not afford superstition. Each time the ship was refurbished, executives ordered cabin 73 opened, inspected, and deemed suitable for guests. Each time, something went wrong. A passenger placed in the room would vanish by morning, or fall violently ill, raving about voices whispering in their sleep, pulling them toward the wall. The last attempt ended with a woman found dead inside, her face twisted in terror, her fingernails broken, as though she had clawed at the walls in her final moments. After that, the cabin was sealed permanently. Passengers who stumbled upon it would sometimes ask the crew why the door was locked, why the curtains remained closed when every other balcony glimmered with light. The answers varied. Some said the room was used for storage, others claimed it was damaged and uninhabitable. But those who pressed harder always noticed the same thing. The way the crew's faces tightened, the way their voices lowered, as though speaking too much of it gave the room power. Some passengers ignored the warnings. They treated it as a curiosity, a game to be played after too many drinks. They lingered outside its door, pressing their ears to the wood, daring one another to knock. Most heard nothing, but some swore they heard movement from within, a dragging sound, like furniture being pushed, or worse, the sound of someone breathing slow and ragged, just inches away from where they stood. There were stories of keys turning by themselves, of the handle trembling as though something on the other side was desperate to escape. And though the cabin was chained and bolted, some passengers claimed to glimpse shapes through the crack beneath the door, shadows sliding across the floor in patterns that did not match footsteps. The most unsettling tale came from a steward who made the mistake of walking that hallway during the night shift. He said he heard knocking from inside the locked room. Not random, but rhythmic. 3 sharp raps. A pause, then 3 more. Against his better judgment, he whispered through the door, asking if someone was inside. The knocking stopped. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, something knocked back. This time from behind him, from the opposite wall of the corridor. He ran, never setting foot in that hallway again. Over the years, the cabin became legend, a dark heart pulsing within the ship, silent but never still. Some believed it was cursed by the family who vanished, others that the sea itself had marked it, dragging its presence through every voyage the Celestia Maris ever made. But one truth remained, undeniable and constant. No matter how many locks, chains or warnings were placed upon it, passengers would always be drawn to cabin. Curiosity is a fragile thing at sea, and when the ocean waits just beyond the walls, Silence becomes its own kind of lure. What happened to those who lingered too long outside that door, the records will never say. But whispers remain. And in the silence of certain nights, when the hallways grow cold and the laughter of the upper decks fades into nothing, some still hear it, the faint sound of a child laughing inside the locked cabin. The longer a ship sails, the heavier its secrets become, and as the Celestia Maris carried passengers across black waters, Cabin 7, its door might have been sealed, its locks secured, but whatever lived within had no need for keys. The stories began again one summer voyage, when the ship was filled to capacity. Passengers who had never met one another began reporting the same dream. They dreamed of standing in a darkened hallway, the carpet soaked through, the walls dripping with condensation. At the far end of the corridor was a door. Brass numbers glimmered faintly, 733. Some said they were pulled toward it, unable to stop themselves. Others said they awoke screaming, just as the handle began to turn. But what frightened the crew most was the timing. Dozens of passengers across different decks had the same dream, on the same night. By the fourth evening the atmosphere had shifted. Entire families avoided that part of the ship. The hallway outside 733 grew colder, lights flickering, as though the wiring itself recoiled from the door. The walls sweated moisture that smelled faintly of seawater, staining the wallpaper in dark streaks. And then people began to disappear. The first was a young couple on their honeymoon. They were last seen walking hand in hand along the corridor near cabin 733, giggling drunkenly, daring one another to knock on the forbidden door. Their laughter was heard once, sharp and clear, then silent. By morning, their cabin was empty, their belongings untouched. Their names were quietly struck from the passenger manifest. The second was a steward. He was new, unfamiliar with the whispered rules of the ship, sent to polish railings on deck 7. He was last spotted near the sealed cabin, his cleaning trolley parked neatly by the wall. Hours later, when the trolley was found abandoned, the crew assumed he had shirked his duties, but his cabin was never slept in again. Passengers grew frantic, but the captain insisted all was well. He told them storms had delayed communication. That confusion was natural on long voyages, but his eyes betrayed his words. He avoided the 7th deck altogether, walking long routes to bypass that cursed stretch of hall. On the 7th night, the ship's storm shutters rattled as wind tore across the sea. Thunder rolled overhead, and passengers huddled inside their cabins as rain lashed against the glass. Yet through the howling storm, one sound cut sharply through the noise: knocking. It came in threes, slow, heavy, from cabin 733. Stewards on night patrol froze in their tracks. They swore the sound wasn't muffled. It was as though the knocks came from deep within the walls themselves, as though someone was trapped behind the door, desperate to be free. When one steward finally approached, his flashlight beam landed on something impossible. The brass handle of cabin 733 was turning. Slowly, gently, though the door was chained, bolted and sealed with steel. It quivered as though something on the other side was testing its strength. The steward dropped his light. By the time he snatched it up again, the hallway was empty, except for wet footprints trailing away from the cabin door. The next morning, the hallway reeked of salt water. Dark stains marked the carpet, spreading outward from beneath the locked door. The smell was strongest there: brine, rot, and something sour, like lungs filled with stagnant water. Passengers began refusing to stay on that deck. Some demanded transfers to other cabins. Some begged to leave the ship altogether. The cruise line silenced them with discounts, apologies, and lies. But the truth was clear. The cabin was awake again. The final night came with an unnatural stillness. The sea was calm, the stars veiled by thin mist, and the ship drifted as though suspended in a dream. That was when the laughter began. It came from cabins, high-pitched, childlike, giggling, at first faint, almost harmless, but growing louder until it echoed down the halls, bouncing off the walls in distorted echo. Passengers who heard it locked their doors, shoving furniture against them, praying silently into the dark. But prayers mean nothing to the sea. Those who dared peek through their cabin peepholes saw something that would haunt them forever. The hallway was no longer empty. Figures stood outside cabin 733, wet, pale, motionless. A man with water dripping from his sleeves, a woman with seaweed tangled in her hair, children clutching deflated life vests. Their eyes glimmered faintly in the dim light, and all at once, they turned their heads, slowly, together, staring at the onlookers through the peepholes. Those who screamed claimed their cries were swallowed by silence, as though the ship itself refused to carry the sound. Those who prayed said they felt cold breath against their necks, even while locked in their room. By morning, the hallway was empty again. The stains had vanished. The smell had dissipated. Only the locked cabin remained, its brass number plate dulled, its curtains drawn. But 6 passengers never left the ship. Their names were erased from the manifest, their belongings vanished, and the cruise line tightened its silence, threatening those who spoke too loudly of what had happened. Still, the whispers persisted. Cabin 733 is never opened now. It remains sealed, avoided by crew, erased from maps of the ship. But those who sail on the Celeste Maris sometimes find themselves in its hallway without meaning to, as though the ship has guided them there. They walk faster, heads down, hearts pounding. They do not stop. They do not look, because those who linger too long outside its doors sometimes hear it. The laughter of a child, the knocking of unseen hands, and the faint sound of salt water dripping onto the floor. The sea does not forget, and some cabins should never be opened. The ocean hides many faces, but none are more unsettling than fog. At night, when it rolls across the sea, it swallows everything. Stars, horizon, even the ship itself, until all that exists is a world of shifting gray. To be adrift in fog is to drift between realms, where the living and the dead breathe the same air.
The Elysian star was 3 days into its journey when the fog came. At first it was thin, delicate as lace, brushing the ship's hull in wisps. But by midnight it had thickened into a wall of white so dense that even the ship's own bow disappeared from sight. The sea was silent, the passengers uneasy, and the fog did not lift. The next day came and went without sunlight. The fog clung like a second skin, muffling sound, dampening every laugh and shout into a hollow echo. The ship pressed on, engines humming steadily, but the passengers felt it. They were no longer moving through the world they had left behind. It was on the second night that the music began. A faint violin, delicate, mournful, drifting through the mist. At first, passengers thought it was entertainment arranged by the ship, perhaps a late-night performance on the upper deck. But when they followed the sound, they found the lounges empty, the stages dark. Still the music played, thin and distant, weaving its way through the fog. By the third night it grew louder, more instruments joined, cellos, violas, the soft pulse of a piano. The sound rose and fell with uncanny precision, as though an entire orchestra stood somewhere just beyond sight, hidden by the endless shroud. Some passengers swore they could make out voices too, faint choirs humming from deep within the fog. Curiosity gave way to dread when the crew admitted the truth. No musicians were playing. The ship's orchestras had ended their sets hours earlier, their instruments locked away. No sound system was active, yet the music carried on, each note twisting through the mist like an invitation. Passengers began vanishing soon after. The first was a woman seen walking the upper deck, her hand resting on the railing as she leaned into the fog, humming along with the violin. She was last seen smiling faintly, stepping toward the sound. By morning her cabin was empty. The second was a group of 3 friends. They boasted loudly of following the music to its source, convinced it was a prank or hidden performance. Their laughter faded into the mist, swallowed whole. None returned. The most terrifying account came from a steward who swore he saw figures in the fog itself, shadowed shapes, standing in rows as though seated with instruments in hand. Their outlines swayed with the rhythm of the music, heads bowed, bows rising and falling in silence. When lightning flashed far above, for the briefest second he saw them clearly, an orchestra dressed in uniforms, a century out of date, faces pale, eyes hollow, and behind them, passengers, hundreds of them, standing still, watching. The steward staggered back in horror. When he looked again, there was only fog. But the music never stopped. Passengers began locking their doors at night, some stuffed towels beneath the cracks, trying to keep the sound out. But it seeped through, rising from the very walls as though the ship itself had learned the melody. Some claimed the music wove into their dreams, pulling them through fog-drenched hallways, guiding them toward an unseen stage where shadows waited with open arms. And always, when they woke, another cabin was empty. The captain attempted to reassure everyone, insisting the fog was natural, the disappearances coincidental, but his words rang hollow when the ship's logbooks revealed a terrifying pattern. Decades earlier, the Elysian star had vanished for 3 full days during a similar voyage. When it reappeared, drifting silently into port, a third of its passengers were gone, no lifeboats missing, no distress calls sent, just gone. Survivors spoke of music in the fog. Music no one would ever acknowledge again. And now it was happening once more. The fog did not lift. By the 6th night, passengers had stopped asking when it would clear. They simply moved through it, as though the ship now existed in a world without sun, without horizon, without escape. Some stopped eating. Others slept in the daylight hours, hoping the nights would pass fast. But the music never ceased. It changed, growing more intricate with each passing evening. What had begun as a lone violin became a full performance, sweeping crescendos rising from nowhere, weaving through the ship like tendrils of mist. No matter where you stood, the dining hall, the theater, even sealed in your cabin, the music was there, faint but undeniable. Some passengers began to follow it. They rose from their cabins at night, barefoot, drifting through the halls as though sleepwalking. Witnesses spoke of men and women in nightclothes, walking toward the upper deck, their eyes half closed, their lips moving as though humming along with the phantom orchestra. Crew members who tried to stop them were met with blank stares, soft murmurs, "I hear it, I have to go." And when they stepped into the fog, they did not return. By the 7th night, the disappearances could no longer be hidden. Entire cabins stood empty. Families were torn apart. Mothers wailed for children who had wandered out into the mist. Husbands searched frantically for wives who had vanished between one song and the next. Yet the captain ordered silence, forbidding the crew from speaking of what was happening. He insisted they keep to their duties, though his own hands shook when he thought no one was watching. But the fog was watching. Those who lingered near the railings swore they saw shapes drifting alongside the ship. Not lifeboats, not other vessels, figures. Hundreds of them, their outlines wavering in the mist. Some stood motionless, some swayed gently, but all faced the ship, as though drawn to it. One man claimed he recognized a face among them, his brother, who had vanished 2 nights earlier. He screamed his name into the fog, begged him to come back, but the figure only tilted its head, and in the next swell of music, disappeared from sight. The orchestra grew bolder, the melodies turned brighter, faster, almost jubilant. Violins soared, trumpets blared, drums thundered from nowhere. It was as if the ship was surrounded by a celebration, a concert meant for an audience that no longer lived. And as the music swelled, more passengers vanished. The few who resisted described unbearable pressure in their skulls, as though the sound itself were inside them, vibrating through their bones. Some clutched their ears, until they bled, yet the music never dulled. Others collapsed, whispering through tears that they could see them, the musicians, standing in the fog with hollow eyes, their bows moving in silence, their instruments dripping with seawater. The climax came on the 9th night. The fog thickened until even the nearest handrail disappeared into white. The ship seemed suspended in nothing, every sound muffled but for the orchestra's relentless swell. Then the lights flickered and died. Passengers screamed in the dark. Crew scrambled for lanterns, and in that pitch-black void, the music reached its crescendo, deafening, ecstatic, as though played by 1,000 unseen hands. When the emergency lights finally flared back to life, dozens more passengers were gone. Cabins stood open, belongings scattered, their occupants erased as though plucked out of existence, and those who remained swore they had seen, for one impossible moment, the source of the sound. Through the fog, just beyond the ship, a second vessel drifted, black, ancient, its deck crowded with figures. An orchestra stood at its bow, uniforms rotted, instruments gleaming wet in the dim light. Behind them, rows of passengers filled the deck, silent and staring, their faces familiar, those who had vanished over the last 9 nights. The vision lasted only seconds before the fog swallowed it whole, but the truth had been seen. The Elysian star was not alone. By dawn, the fog began to thin, the music faded into silence, and when the horizon finally returned, the ship carried fewer passengers than it had days before. Their names were erased from the manifest, their cabins reassigned, their memories buried beneath layers of official reports and fabricated explanations. But the survivors never forgot. They spoke of the fog that sang, of the music that called to the soul like a lullaby from the abyss. Some claimed they still hear it in their dreams, faint strings drifting through the night, promising reunion, if only they step into the mist. And sailors who travel the same waters today whisper that the fog sometimes rises without warning. If you listen closely, you can hear violins in the distance, and if you stare long enough into the white, you may see a ship drifting alongside yours, a ship with no living crew, a ship that plays for the dead. The sea remembers its orchestra, and it will play until every seat is filled. The grandeur of a cruise ship lies not only in its shining chandeliers and polished decks, but in the invisible hands that keep it alive. Beneath the glamour of dining halls and theaters, an army of workers labors unseen: cooks, stewards, cleaners, engineers. They move through hidden corridors, secret staircases, and shadowed storage rooms that most passengers never glimpse. A floating city, powered by sweat. But what happens when the crew never leaves? The Ocean Reverie was a jewel of its fleet, a vessel celebrated for its service. Passengers spoke of staff who seemed tireless, always present, always ready with a smile. Some joked that the crew hardly slept at all, appearing in multiple parts of the ship within minutes, as though they had mastered the art of being everywhere at once. The truth was far darker.
Long before its luxury voyages, the Reverie had endured a tragedy buried in silence. During its early years at sea, a fire erupted deep within the crew quarters, choking the hidden passageways with black smoke. Dozens of workers perished, trapped below deck, their cries drowned by the roar of the flames. Officially, the deaths were minimized in the record, but the crew who came afterward whispered that their predecessors had never left. At first it was little things. Passengers reported late-night knocks on their doors, only to find no one in the hallway. Some swore they saw stewards standing at the end of corridors, pale and motionless, disappearing when approached. Housekeeping logs showed cabins cleaned before staff had even reached them. Beds made, glasses polished, carpets vacuumed by unseen hands. A maid confided in her journal that she often found folded towels in shapes she had not made. Swans, flowers, and once a noose. She tried to laugh it off, but soon began dreading her shifts.
The kitchen staff spoke of shadows crossing their workstations, of footsteps pacing in the storage holds when no one was inside. Once, a chef heard the sound of knives chopping in the prep room, but when he opened the door, the room was empty. Still on the counter lay neat slices of vegetables, arranged with surgical precision. Then came the sighting. Passengers began to describe crew members whose names never appeared on the roster. A steward with hollow eyes, carrying a tray of drinks down the hall, a cleaner scrubbing the floor in silence, her movements mechanical, her uniform decades out of date, a bellboy pushing an empty cart, never speaking, never stopping, his shoes leaving wet footprints on the carpet. One couple claimed they woke in the night to find a man in uniform standing in their cabin. He did not move, did not blink, just stared at them with a face grey as ash before fading into the dark. The crew themselves were not spared. A housekeeper collapsed after swearing she saw a fellow worker polishing mirrors in a locked cabin. When she returned minutes later with a supervisor, the cabin was untouched, the mirror streaked with soot instead of shine. Below deck the whispers grew louder. Engineers complained of tools vanishing, only to reappear neatly lined along the pipe. Laundry staff said they often heard whistling in the steam rooms, a mournful tune rising through the hiss of the machines. Yet when they followed the sound, they found only empty corridors, the air colder than ice. The worst stories came from the crew quarters themselves. Workers often woke to the sound of coughing, wet, ragged, desperate. Some claimed to smell smoke in the air, thick and choking, though no alarms rang. Others woke with ash smeared across their sheets, or the faint outline of a hand pressed into their pillow. By now the staff whispered of the burned ones, the workers lost in the fire decades before. They said these spirits had not left their posts, bound to their duties even in death. To them the ship was eternal service, an endless shift with no release, and passengers unknowingly were being served by both the living and the dead. The ocean reverie carried on with its voyages, gleaming on the surface but rotting in silence beneath. Those who worked its lower decks grew pale and sleepless, their eyes shadowed with fear. The passengers remained unaware, marveling at the ship's uncanny perfection. Their cabins always spotless, their meals always on time, their requests answered before they were even spoken. But the living crew knew the truth. The dead were working beside them. It began to escalate on a night when the ship cut through a restless sea. The waves hammered its hull, and the wind howled through the upper decks like a choir of lost voices. In the galley, a steward carried trays of wine, only to see another figure step out of the misty corridor. It wore the same crisp uniform, but its skin was blistered and cracked, its lips blackened, its eyes milky white. The figure reached for the tray, lifted a glass with charred fingers, and carried it away without a word. The steward dropped the rest of the drinks in terror, but when others came rushing in, there was no sign of the burnt figure. Only the sound of footsteps retreating deeper into the crew passage. After that, the encounters grew bolder. Guests spoke of their meals being served by silent waiters, whose names were not on the staff list. Some even tipped them, only for the money to vanish hours later, the notes scorched as if touched by fire. A chambermaid found a group of passengers weeping after a midnight encounter. A woman in a ruined uniform had appeared at their door, whispering, "Service never ends," before dissolving into smoke. The laundry rooms became unbearable. Staff reported clothing pressed and folded before they could even touch it, laid out in perfect stacks, yet reeking of burned fabric. When one attendant tried to ignore it, he returned minutes later to find every article of clothing in the room slashed, charred and marked with handprints the color of soot. In the crew corridors, the air grew thick. Lights flickered, casting warped shadows on the wall. Workers often found themselves walking behind others, only to watch their companion vanish mid-step, leaving the corridor empty. A cook, cornered by whispers, fled into a stairwell, and emerged moments later with burns along his arms, though no fire had touched him. By then even the passengers began to notice. They spoke in hushed voices of staff members who never smiled, who moved with strange jerking motions, their uniforms decades out of date. Some said these figures appeared in the background of photographs, faces blistered, eyes hollow, lurking behind the living. Others claimed to wake in the night to find their room freshly cleaned, every surface gleaming, though no crew had entered. On the mirror, a message scrawled in condensation, "Still working." The climax came during a storm at sea. Lightning split the skies, and the ship trembled with every crash of thunder. Guests crowded the lounges, uneasy, while the crew rushed to keep order. And then they appeared, the burned ones. From the stairwells, from the corridors, from the hidden doors only the staff used, they came. Dozens of them, uniforms in tatters, skin cracked like overbaked clay, smoke trailing from their mouths. They moved among the passengers without speaking, without blinking, carrying trays, sweeping floors, refilling glasses. The living crew froze in terror. The passengers whispered, thinking it was some theatrical performance, a macabre show put on by the ship for dramatic effect. But when one guest reached to thank a waiter, her hand recoiled from the freezing grip of fingers that left blackened smears on her skin. And then the illusion collapsed. The burned ones stopped their silent work and turned to face the living. Their eyes glowed faintly, their mouths opening in a low, unearthly groan. The lights went out. Panic erupted. In the pitch dark, passengers screamed as icy hands clutched at them, as whispers rose from the shadows. "Service never ends. Service never ends." The storm raged on outside, but inside the ship another storm was brewing. People shoved their way toward exits, trampling each other in desperation. Crew members tried to hold order, but many themselves fled, some swearing they saw their own reflections peeling away from mirrors, to join the ranks of the dead. Hours later, the storm broke, the lights returned, and the burned ones were gone. But the ship was changed. Passengers were missing. Cabins once full stood empty. Their names were erased from the manifest, their belongings quietly discarded. Survivors whispered that the burned ones had taken them below, absorbed them into their endless shift. To this day, those who sail the ocean reverie report strange comforts. Beds made without reason, meals prepared before they are ordered, footsteps in the halls when no one is there, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, a shadow at the end of the corridor pausing only long enough to whisper, "Service never ends." A cruise ship is a city afloat, thousands of souls enclosed within steel walls, adrift on waters deeper than imagination. In such a place, every movement is accounted for, every passenger carefully logged, every room assigned. And yet, people vanish. They vanish without witnesses, without warning, without a trace. On the Sapphire Empress, one such disappearance has never faded from memory. It began like any other voyage, sunlight shimmering on the decks, laughter rising from the pools, the scent of food wafting from endless buffets. Among the thousands aboard was a woman named Eleanor Price. Middle-aged, quiet, unassuming, she had booked the cruise as a solitary retreat, a break from the weight of her ordinary life. She was often seen alone, reading in shaded corners, sipping tea at the lounge, walking the observation deck at dusk. But then one night she was gone. Her cabin was discovered untouched, the bed still made, her suitcase neatly unpacked, her journal lying open on the desk. It was not until housekeeping noticed her absence at breakfast the next morning that questions arose. At first the crew assumed she was simply keeping to herself, but as the hours passed, concern grew. The search began. Every hallway, every deck, every restaurant and lounge was checked. The security cameras were combed through frame by frame, and that is where the unease began to spread. Eleanor had been seen walking the main corridor just after midnight, heading toward her cabin. She passed under several cameras, her face calm, her steps measured. She reached her door. The footage showed her swiping her keycard, the light flashing green, and then nothing.
She never entered. The door opened, but the frame showed only emptiness. No figure stepping inside, no body crossing the threshold. One moment she was there, her hand on the handle, her reflection faintly mirrored in the metal door. The next moment, gone. The footage was replayed again and again. Investigators insisted the camera must have glitched, but others swore they saw something different. Her reflection lingered a moment longer than it should have, watching, staring back even as she disappeared. Passengers whispered in dread. The ship carried on with its schedule, but beneath the glamour, fear spread like a sickness. People began locking their doors, avoiding the corridors at night, speaking of the woman who never entered. And then the sightings began. A passenger claimed to see Eleanor on the observation deck 2 nights later, standing at the railing, her face pale, her eyes empty. When approached, she turned, not with recognition, but with a stare so hollow that the witness fled. Others said they glimpsed her wandering the halls in silence, always at night, always near the cabin she never entered. The crew, under strict orders, denied everything. They filed the disappearance as unexplained, quietly noting that Eleanor was far from the first to vanish this way. Her name was erased from the passenger logs, her belongings discreetly locked away. The ship continued its voyage, carrying thousands more, as though nothing had happened, but the fear lingered. For if Eleanor could vanish between one step and the next, then who else might follow? The Sapphire Empress sailed on, her lights glittering against the vast blackness of the sea. To the passengers above, she was a palace of indulgence, dinners, music, games, endless comfort. But below the surface of celebration, unease spread like cracks in glass. Eleanor Price was gone, and the ship, it seemed, wanted no one to remember her. Her cabin was sealed by the crew, a polite maintenance sign hung on its door. Passengers were told it was a technical issue, nothing more. Yet, those who lingered in the corridor swore they could still hear faint scratching from within, like fingernails on steel, like someone locked inside, trying to get out. One guest, curious and defiant, pressed her ear to the door. What she heard drove her into hysterics, a whisper, faint and strained, repeating the same words again and again. "Don't open it. Don't open it. Don't open it." But worse than the whispers were the vanishings that followed. 3 days later, another passenger disappeared. A man named Christopher Hale, last seen heading toward the elevators on deck 7. The footage showed him waiting, staring at the numbers above the doors. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. He stepped inside. The camera blinked for a fraction of a second, and the elevator was empty. No man, no movement, just silence. When the crew opened the elevator hours later, they found it spotless, the scent of salt water lingering inside. Hale was never seen again. Panic began to take root. People spoke in hushed tones, warning each other not to walk alone at night, not to linger in the halls where the cameras glitched. And yet, no one dared confront the truth aloud. The ship was devouring its passengers. Some began seeing Eleanor everywhere. In the dining hall, reflected in silverware. In the theater, seated in the back row, her hands folded, her face expressionless. A family swore she stood outside their cabin at 3 a.m., staring at the door, silent, waiting. Others claimed she was not alone. Figures blurred in the corridors, always at the edge of sight, shapes that seemed human, but whose faces were hollow voids, as though the ship had stripped them of their identity. A child spoke of the lady with no shadow, who followed her down the hallway, vanishing only when her mother turned to look. The crew tightened their silence. Security patrols doubled. The captain made announcements, reassuring guests that all was well. But beneath the false calm, even the staff looked haunted. Some avoided certain decks entirely. Others refused to ride the elevators at night. One steward broke down sobbing, whispering that the ship feeds when it's full.
And then came the night of the storm. Rain lashed the decks and thunder shook the glass windows. Passengers crowded the lounges, uneasy, while the sea churned with a fury that seemed unnatural. As lightning split the sky, the ship's power flickered, lights dimming, cameras failing, monitors going black. In that brief, suffocating darkness, they vanished. 5 more passengers, gone without sound, without trace. Rooms left empty, belongings untouched, names erased from the manifest as though they had never been there. When the lights returned, panic consumed the Sapphire Empress. Some guests demanded evacuation, others barricaded their cabins, clutching crucifixes and whispering prayers. But there was no escape. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, and the ship pressed forward into the night, her hull groaning as if alive. Those who survived that voyage never forgot what they saw. They spoke of Eleanor, last seen at the very end of the storm, standing on the promenade deck, her pale hand resting on the railing. She turned, her eyes black and endless, her mouth moving without sound, and behind her, in the reflection of the glass windows, countless faces stared out, faces of those who had vanished, pressed against the glass from the other side, watching, waiting. The Sapphire Empress still sails today, its reputation polished, its tragedies buried beneath layers of denial. But every voyage carries the risk of feeding the ship again, and every now and then, a cabin is quietly sealed, an elevator suddenly taken out of service, a name scrubbed from the records. The ocean keeps its secrets, and so do the ships that cross it, because some vessels are not merely built to carry passengers, they are built to consume them. There are tragedies at sea that can be explained. Mechanical failure, fire, storms that batter a vessel until it breaks apart. For every disaster, there is a cause that can be named, studied, understood. But then there are the vanishings, not of passengers, not of crew, but of entire ships, swallowed whole, erased from existence, leaving nothing behind. The case of the Aurora Skies is one of the most haunting of them all. Launched in the late 1970s, she was a towering luxury liner, hailed as one of the safest of her time. Gleaming white decks, glittering dining halls, and 1,000 passengers at her capacity. She made countless successful voyages, ferrying travelers across the Atlantic, her name associated with glamour and wealth. But in the summer of 1982, she vanished. Her last transmission came during a clear evening. The captain's voice calm as he reported calm seas and a steady course. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. And then, silence. When radio operators tried to reach her the following morning, no signal returned. By noon, alarm spread. By nightfall, search and rescue operations swept across the waters where she should have been. They found nothing. No wreckage, no lifeboats, no oil slick, no debris, not a single life vest floating on the waves. It was as if the Aurora Skies had never existed. And yet, she had. Families of the passengers grieved, demanding answers that never came. The shipping company released carefully worded statements, suggesting an unpredictable weather event or mechanical fault may have caused the ship to sink. But the survivors of other tragedies knew better. A ship that large does not vanish without leaving a trace. Something darker had occurred. The whispers began soon after. Other vessels crossing the Atlantic reported strange sightings, lights glimmering on the horizon, where no ship should. The faint sound of music drifting across the waves, violins, laughter, the clinking of glasses as though a grand party continued, forever suspended in time. One freighter reported seeing her out in the middle of a moonless night. The watch spotted a massive ship appearing on their radar, closing distance at impossible speed. When the crew rushed to the deck, they saw her, the Aurora Skies, lights blazing, her decks alive with shadowy figures moving to unheard rhythms. She passed silently, her hull gleaming in the starlight, yet no voice called out, no horn sounded, And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she dissolved into mist. The men swore it was no hallucination. The radar had confirmed it. Their logbooks recorded the encounter, and still, when authorities questioned them later, the report was dismissed as fatigue, as paranoia, as superstition. But whispers spread among sailors. The Aurora skies had not sunk. She had crossed into something else, a place the sea does not return from. Some believe the ship is trapped in endless waters, a limbo between life and death, doomed to sail forever. Others whisper that it was claimed by something ancient, that the ocean itself demanded her, as a sacrifice, her 1,000 souls feeding the hunger that can never be satisfied. What is certain is this: the Aurora skies never docked again. Her name was quietly erased from records, her memory buried in silence. But even now, ships that pass through her last known coordinates report strange disturbances, compass needles spinning wildly, radios filled with static, and in rare moments, a voice cutting through the noise, a calm, distant voice, repeating the same words, over and over again.
This is the Aurora skies. We are still on course. Repeat. We are still on course. The Aurora skies had vanished from the maps of men, but not from the ocean itself. The sea remembers everything it has claimed, and sometimes it allows those memories to surface. Years after her disappearance, more sightings came. A fishing crew off the coast of Newfoundland reported a colossal silhouette drifting in the fog, its lights glowing faintly as though seen through water. They swore they could hear faint strains of music, an orchestra swelling, followed by a chorus of laughter that rose and fell like the tide. When one man shouted into the mist, the laughter ceased instantly, and then came the sound of screaming. Not one voice, but hundreds. The cries of men, women and children, all overlapping in a cacophony of terror that rose until it shook the very air. The crew fled in panic, abandoning half their equipment. When they returned days later to recover it, the sea was empty once again. But others were not as fortunate. In 1994, a small private yacht reported a collision with an unmarked vessel. The survivors were rescued weeks later, drifting half-mad, their eyes hollow, their skin burned from exposure. When questioned, they claimed they had struck a massive ship that appeared out of nowhere. The impact threw them into chaos. But when they looked back, there was nothing, only black waves. The rescuers dismissed their account as delusion, but among sailors, the whispers grew louder. Some swore the Aurora skies was cursed, not to sail alone, that any vessel straying too close to her last route might glimpse her, and those who did would be marked. They told stories of crew members vanishing months later, of passengers waking from dreams of drowning, salt water dripping from their hair though they had never touched the sea. And then came the tale of the mariner's oath. In 2003, the cargo ship crossed the Atlantic on a routine voyage. At 2:17 a.m., their radar picked up a massive contact closing in. The watchman looked out and saw her, the Aurora skies gleaming, impossibly pristine. Her decks filled with figures moving in eerie silence. The captain, seasoned and skeptical, ordered the ship to hold course. He refused to bow to superstition. But as the phantom liner drew nearer, a voice crackled over the radio. It was calm, stately, unmistakably human. This is the Aurora skies. All is well. We are still on course. The crew froze. The signal was strong, undeniable, coming from the very ship before them. Yet as they listened, the words began to twist. The voice repeated them again, slower this time, louder, until it sounded less like reassurance and more like a warning. We are still on course. The lights of the Aurora skies flared brilliantly, flooding the mariner's oath in white. And then, as if drawn into mist, she dissolved before their eyes. When the cargo ship docked days later, their logbooks were blank. Not a page of their journey remained, not a single word of what they had seen. It was as though the sea itself had erased their account, leaving only the terror branded into the eyes of the men. To this day, no explanation exists. Some maritime historians speculate about rogue waves, magnetic anomalies, or hidden wrecks on the ocean floor, but sailors know better. They whisper that the Aurora skies never sank, that she sails still trapped in a spectral current, her 1,000 passengers forever bound to a voyage that has no end. Some say if you listen carefully in the dead of night, when the sea is calm, and the air too still, you can hear the distant echo of her engines, the faint waltz of her orchestra, the laughter of her guests, suspended in time. And if you are unlucky enough to cross her path, you may hear the captain's voice yourself. A calm voice, drifting across the static of your radio. This is the Aurora skies. We are still on course. Repeat, we are still on course. But those who hear it never truly escape, because once the sea marks you with her ghost, the voyage is never over. The sea does not always consume in violence. Sometimes it steals quietly. There are ships that have burned, ships that have broken in half under storms, ships that have vanished without debris. But perhaps the most unnerving are the vessels that are found whole, gleaming and unbroken, yet utterly, impossibly empty. One of the most infamous cases took place in 1990. The Elysian, a luxury cruise liner, set sail from Southampton on a transatlantic voyage. On board were more than 800 passengers, along with nearly 300 crew members, families, honeymooners, retirees, all eager for the grand journey across the ocean. The weather was clear. Spirits were high. By all accounts, it was meant to be a smooth and uneventful voyage. But 6 days later, a Norwegian tanker spotted her drifting aimlessly in the mid-Atlantic. Her course was erratic, her speed inconsistent. At first the tanker's captain assumed her systems had failed, leaving her powerless. But as they drew closer, something else became clear. The ship looked perfect. Her lights were still on. Her decks were spotless. The waves lapped softly against her sides. But there was no smoke, no scorch marks, no sign of a fire or collision. When the boarding party climbed aboard, what they found was stranger still. The ship was completely deserted. Every cabin had been made up, the beds neatly arranged, luggage still stacked by doors. Meals half eaten were left on dining tables, silverware laid out as though the diners had simply stepped away. In the ballroom, glasses of champagne sat untouched, their bubbles long since faded. But there was no one, not a single passenger, not a single member of the crew. The search teams combed every deck, every stairwell, every lifeboat. The life rafts were all accounted for, the emergency systems untouched. There were no signs of panic, no scrawled messages, no blood, no evidence of violence. It was as though more than 1,000 people had simply evaporated into the air. The bridge told the same story. Instruments still glowed faintly, recording a normal course and speed, until the moment the ship began to drift. The captain's logbook was open on the desk, his last entry written in a steady hand. All is well, weather calm, spirits high. 22:45. No further words followed, and yet, searchers reported something unsettling. The ship did not feel abandoned. One man claimed he heard faint footsteps in the corridors, just beyond sight, the sound always receding. As he followed, another swore he heard a child laughing in one of the empty cabins. Though every door he opened revealed nothing but silence, the air itself felt charged, heavy, as though hundreds of unseen eyes were watching from every corner. When the boarding crew regrouped, one of them noticed something chilling. The dining hall, once pristine when they had entered, now looked wrong. The cutlery was scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, plates shattered, and at the far end of the hall the champagne glasses that had been filled now lay cracked and empty, the liquid absorbed into the carpet. The men fled in terror. The Elysian was eventually towed to port. Investigators scoured her from bow to stern, looking for answers, but they found nothing. Not a drop of blood, not a single body. Every explanation: pirates, mutiny,
Mass evacuation failed under scrutiny. There were no lifeboats missing, no distress calls, no damage to indicate an attack. The official record remains. Cause of abandonment unknown, but sailors whisper the truth. They say the Elysian was claimed not by storm or violence, but by something older, something that came aboard in silence, moving through the ship unseen, stripping away every soul as though plucking candles from a darkened hall, something that left the vessel itself untouched. As a warning, the Elysian was not the only ship left to drift, beautiful but hollow, a floating tomb with no corpses. In 1931 there was the case of the Bachimo, an Arctic trading ship. She became locked in ice off the coast of Alaska. Her crew evacuated, convinced she would sink, but she didn't. For more than 30 years, the Bachimo was sighted drifting, perfectly intact, through the frozen seas. Sailors swore they could see figures on her decks, shadows moving along the railings, though no one ever answered their calls. Some even boarded her, only to flee in terror after hearing doors slamming, chains dragging across the deck, and whispers in the empty cabins. The Bachimo was last spotted in 1969, vanishing into the ice, never to return. But cruise ships are different. They are not workhorses of the Arctic. They are palaces at sea, filled with laughter, lights, and life. When one is found without its people, the horror is magnified. The most disturbing example came in 2012, when a massive white cruise liner was spotted adrift near Bermuda. Coast Guard helicopters circled her, expecting a distress call. Instead, they were met with silence. The decks were deserted, the pools still rippling gently as though swimmers had just climbed out. The restaurants smelled faintly of roasted meat and sweet desserts, though no one was there to serve them. When boarding crews entered, they reported a suffocating atmosphere. Cabins were filled with luggage, photographs, passports, proof that passengers had been there only hours before. And yet, there were no signs of evacuation. The lifeboats were secured, the emergency stations untouched. Every clock aboard had frozen at 3:17 a.m., though the ship's power still hummed through its veins. And then came the detail that investigators never released to the public. In the Grand Theatre, velvet seats lined in perfect rows. Every single chair was turned to face the back wall away from the stage, all 600 of them. No one could explain how or why. The ship was towed into port, and then quietly, it was dismantled, piece by piece, as though authorities feared what it might hold. No official record of the incident remains, only whispers from those who saw it. Some say the ship had been boarded by pirates, who left no trace. Others speak of mass hysteria, or a failed experiment in the navigation systems. But sailors tell a different story. They speak of a predator that stalks the sea, not a shark, nor a monster of flesh and teeth, but something older, something without form. It slips aboard under cover of night, moving like fog through ventilation shafts and open doors. It takes what it wants, not the ship, not the cargo, but the people. Entire crowds, pulled away in silence, leaving their surroundings untouched. The vessels left behind are not mistakes. They are offerings, messages, proof that the ocean is not ours, and never will be. Those who believe this tale warn against boarding abandoned ships. They claim the emptiness is contagious, that stepping foot inside is an invitation to join the vanished. Some crews swear that men who lingered too long on ghost ships later disappeared themselves, vanishing from their own bunks in the middle of the night, leaving behind nothing but clothes laid out neatly on their bed. To this day, maritime law requires all abandoned vessels to be investigated, catalogued and reported. But there are rumors of cruise liners quietly towed to hidden docks, stripped in secrecy, their names erased from registry.
Because sometimes the greatest horror is not what is destroyed, but what is left behind. And the ocean always leaves something behind. A ship with lights still burning, cabins still waiting, and a silence so vast it feels alive. There is a unique horror in water. Fire consumes quickly, but water, it lingers, it seeps, it rises. It does not rush all at once, but creeps upward, cold and merciless, until it swallows everything. On land we escape upward, into attics, into towers, into the safety of higher ground. But on a ship there is no higher ground, there is only the deck, and when the sea climbs over it, there is nowhere left to run. One of the most chilling cruise disasters unfolded in 1994. The Estonia, a massive ferry carrying nearly 1,000 passengers, set out across the Baltic Sea. It was meant to be a routine voyage. Families gathered in lounges, couples danced in the ballroom, children slept in their bunks. But just after midnight, the sea began to roar. Witnesses later described a sound like grinding metal, followed by a thunderous crash. A huge section of the ship's bow had torn loose, and within minutes, water poured in like a living thing. Panic spread instantly. Cabins became traps as seawater flooded hallways. The elegant carpets turned into rivers, dragging luggage, shoes and toys down toward the lower decks. In the restaurant, tables floated up, colliding with chairs as passengers screamed and clung to chandeliers. The Estonia tilted violently. Lights flickered, then died, plunging hundreds into black water. Survivors later spoke of the sounds that was the worst part. The echo of pounding fists against locked doors, the screams muffled by rising water, the metallic groan of the ship twisting apart as if it were alive. In less than an hour, the Estonia disappeared beneath the Baltic. Only 37 souls were rescued from the freezing waters. More than 850 vanished, locked inside their cabins or dragged down with the wreck. But even that catastrophe does not explain the stories that followed. Fishermen reported strange lights beneath the waves near the wreck site. Some swore they heard cries echoing across the water on calm nights, years after the sinking voices carried not by wind, but from below. Divers who explored the wreck described overwhelming dread, as though invisible hands were tugging at their suits. Some refused to enter the ballroom, where tables still lay scattered, as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. And the Estonia is not alone. There was the Oceanos, a luxury liner that began flooding off the coast of South Africa. When water poured into the engine room, the crew abandoned ship, leaving passengers trapped on board, fumbling in darkness. By sheer luck, helicopters managed to airlift everyone to safety, but survivors later recalled the horror of watching entire decks vanish beneath the rising black tide, knowing that a few more hours would have sealed them inside a floating grave. Cruise ships are not built like warships. They are designed for comfort, for pleasure, for leisure. But when water intrudes, comfort becomes death. Cabins become cages, carpets soak and swell until doors cannot be opened. Elevators fill like aquariums, stairwells become waterfalls, and the music, the cheerful string quartets, the background piano, falls silent under the endless rush of the sea. And for those trapped inside, drowning does not come quickly. It begins with the icy burn of water at the ankles, then at the waist, then at the chest. People climb onto beds, onto dressers, clawing upward for a final gasp of air. As the ceiling lowers, some faint before the end, others fight until their nails splinter against the walls, and then silence. There are wrecks beneath the sea today where the cabins remain sealed. Behind their doors lie passengers who never escaped, preserved in the cold dark, waiting in their drowned hall, waiting, some say, with their eyes still open. The sea has a way of reminding us that no vessel, no matter how grand, is beyond its reach. Consider the Wilhelm Gustloff, 1945. It was not a cruise ship in the modern sense, but a passenger liner pressed into desperate service. More than 10,000 people crammed aboard, soldiers, nurses, families fleeing the collapse of the Third Reich. They filled every corridor, every dining room, every stairwell. Children were tucked beneath tables, their toys still clutched in tiny. The ship was meant to carry half that number, yet desperation has no weight limit. When a torpedo ripped into its hull,
The rush of water was instant. Eyewitnesses said the screams were deafening, a single sound made up of thousands of voices. Mothers fought to lift their children above the rising tide. Men clawed at the ceilings. Some ran toward the decks, only to find the staircases underwater, the doors swollen shut. 9,000 drowned in a single night. The Wilhelm Gustloff remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history, its wreck still a silent tomb beneath the Baltic. Divers who brave it describe narrow passages, where bodies once piled so high they formed barricades against the flood, and vast chambers, where silence hums, as if the screams never left. But disasters are not always torpedoes, not always storms. Sometimes the ship itself betrays its passengers. On the Costa Concordia, in 2012, a pleasure cruise turned into nightmare when the vessel struck rock and capsized. As water spilled through its belly, luxury transformed into chaos. Carpets became rivers, chandeliers shattered and swayed in half-submerged dining halls. People scrambled up sideways hallways, their screams echoing in the tilt. Some who fled downward in confusion drowned in stairwells that became wells of seawater. The wreck was raised, dissected, and studied, but survivors still speak of what cannot be explained. The way the ship groaned like a wounded animal, the way the water seemed to follow them, relentless, no matter how high they climbed. Because in the end the ocean does not rush, it hunts. It waits for one weak spot, one fracture in steel, one careless captain's error. Then it enters like a thief, seeping beneath doors, filling rooms, crawling upstairs, claiming territory inch by inch. It gives passengers time to realize what is happening, time to panic, time to understand. And that may be the most terrifying cruelty of all. Some disasters leave survivors, some do not, but the legends always linger. Tales of drowned ships, where portholes glow faintly at night, as though candles burn within. Fishermen say they hear faint knocking from the depths when nets scrape against wrecks, as if someone inside is still trying to escape. And those who have been inside sunken liners speak of a suffocating presence, as though the sea itself does not like intruders in the graves it has chosen. Cruise liners are designed to be unsinkable, impregnable fortresses of joy, but the water knows no boundaries. It will always find a way in. Because the ocean does not merely kill, it consumes, and when the decks begin to drown, the passengers are not just lost, they are taken. The ocean holds many mysteries, but perhaps none are more chilling than this. A ship that sails onward, perfectly intact, perfectly functional, yet utterly deserted. No passengers, no staff, no captain at the helm, nothing but silence. The most infamous example is the Mary Celeste, discovered in 1872 adrift near the Azores. She was not a cruise liner, but her story has echoed for centuries as a warning. The ship was found in pristine condition, her cargo untouched, her sails full, meals half-eaten on the tables, the captain's logbook still resting on his desk. Even the lifeboats remained secured, yet her crew of 10 had vanished into thin air. Theories swarmed: piracy, mutiny, a seaquake, alcohol fumes igniting in the hold, but none explained why a crew would leave a safe ship in the middle of calm seas. And so the Mary Celeste remains a legend of vanishing souls. But what most do not know is that cruise ships, modern leviathans of steel and glass, have suffered the same fate. In 2002, a massive vessel known as the Jubilee Star was discovered drifting in the Caribbean. Her engines were silent, her lights flickering, like dying candles. Rescue teams boarded, expecting to find survivors or corpses. Instead they found nothing. Cabins were immaculate, beds neatly made, suitcases stacked at the foot of each. Dinner had been served in the grand hall, bowls of soup still steaming when they cooled in the open air, bread left torn beside untouched wine glasses. In the crew's quarters, uniforms hung pressed and folded. Logs indicated that the ship had been on course only hours before, but there were no people, not a scream, not a struggle, not a body. Even stranger, the clocks in every cabin had frozen at the same time, 2:47 a.m. Investigators scoured the ship for weeks. They found no signs of evacuation. Lifeboats were still secured, They found no distress calls in the radio logs, no damage to the hull, no footprints leading off the deck. It was as though the sea had simply plucked the crew and passengers away, one by one, leaving behind the hollow echo of a journey cut short. The Jubilee's Star was eventually towed into harbor and dismantled. No official report was ever released. Some claim it was hushed to prevent panic among cruisegoers, but sailors whisper of strange things seen aboard during the dismantling: chairs slowly turning on their own, faucets opening without touch, and the faint sound of voices singing in languages no one recognized. And the Jubilee Star was not alone. In the Pacific, a ship named the Seabreeze Pearl was found drifting, with every lifeboat still attached. Her navigation systems were functional, her fuel tanks nearly full, but no one remained aboard. The ship was so eerily preserved that investigators described it as more like a stage set than a vessel, every element in place, but no actors to play their roles. No one can agree on what happens in these cases. Some insist it is piracy, crews slaughtered and bodies dumped into the sea. Others speak of mutinies, cover-ups or government experiments, but the stories passed between sailors tell a darker tale. They say there is something in the water, something that climbs aboard ships at night, when the horizon is empty and the sea is calm, something that moves in silence, faster than any scream, capable of taking dozens or even hundreds without leaving a trace, something that does not kill in blood or flame, but steals in silence. And the abandoned ships it leaves behind are not mysteries. They are warning, drifting, waiting, their empty halls echoing with the memories of those who vanished. The mystery of deserted ships is more than a scattering of isolated tales. It is a pattern stretching across centuries, hidden in the folds of maritime history. Consider the Kaz II, a sleek catamaran, discovered adrift off the coast of Australia. From a distance, she looked normal, her sails full, her deck pristine, but when rescuers boarded, they found something impossible. The engine was running, the GPS was working, food was still laid out on the table, coffee cups warm in the sun, life jackets remained untouched, hanging neatly on their hooks. But her three-man crew was gone. The last log entry gave no sign of distress. Weather reports showed calm seas. No mayday had been sent. The men had simply vanished, leaving a ship in perfect order behind them. To this day, their fate remains unknown, and the deeper one digs, the more stories appear. There was the Orang Medan, a Dutch vessel found drifting in the Strait of Malacca. When a boarding party climbed aboard, they were met with horror. The entire crew lay dead, dozens of sailors sprawled across the decks, their faces twisted in terror, mouths frozen in silent screams. Some had their arms raised as if warding off an unseen attacker, yet no wounds marked their bodies. Before the ship could be towed, it exploded and sank, taking with it the truth of what had happened. But among sailors, whispers persist that the crew did not die from poison or panic, that something had boarded them, something unseen, something that left no scars but claimed every soul at once. Modern cruise ships have their own ghost stories. In 2013, the Silver Meridian was reported adrift in the Atlantic. Coast Guard teams boarded, expecting a breakdown. Instead, they found every deck silent. Passengers' belongings were scattered as though abandoned in haste, bags unzipped, toys left on floors, half-played card games on tables, but not a single person remained aboard. Even stranger, the ship's CCTV system showed only static from 2:13 a.m. onward. Every camera, every floor, every hallway. The official report called it a data failure, but those who reviewed the tape swore they heard something buried in the static low, almost like a hum. It is here that the pattern becomes undeniable. Ships found intact, meals still warm, belongings untouched, lifeboats secured, no maydays, no storms, no bodies, just silence. If it were mutiny, there would be signs. If it were piracy, there would be struggle. If it were storm, there would be wreckage. But there is none of these. Instead, what is left behind feels staged, like a performance abruptly halted, the actors pulled from the stage mid-scene, and that raises a chilling possibility. Perhaps these vanishings are not random, perhaps they are not accident, perhaps there is something ancient in the deep, something that has always demanded tribute. It takes not ships, not steel, not treasure, but people. It strips them from their cabins, from their posts, from their very lives, leaving the vessel behind as proof, as bait, as warning. Some whisper it. It is the ocean itself, a hunger older than humanity, older than ships, older than time, a force that does not crash or drown, but simply takes, a force that prefers silence, and when it chooses, no crew survives. The ship sails on, a floating tomb without bodies, a ghost without ghosts, waiting for the next vessel to wander into its gaze. There is a point where steel and machinery, rivets and cables, take on a life of their own. Sailors have always whispered of vessels that seemed to resist their masters, ships that veered from their course as though guided by an unseen hand, ships that refused to obey the helm. And when it comes to cruise liners, massive floating cities, with thousands of souls on board, the consequences of such defiance can be catastrophic. One of the earliest tales comes from the SS Valencia. She was not a cruise ship, but a passenger liner, carrying hundreds, along the jagged coast of Vancouver Island, in heavy fog. The ship should have held its course, yet the compass needle spun wildly, and the wheel refused to respond. Passengers reported that doors locked themselves, trapping people in their cabins. Oil lamps flared with sudden violence. Crewmen swore they heard voices, whispering in the hallways, voices that grew louder the closer the vessel drifted to the rock. When the Valencia finally struck land, it tore open like paper. Lifeboats were lowered, but mysteriously capsized in calm water, as though something unseen had gripped them from beneath. Of more than 170 people aboard, only a handful survived. But what cemented the Valencia's reputation as more than a wreck was what came after. For years, sailors swore they saw her phantom still drifting through fog off Vancouver, her decks lit by ghostly lanterns, her passengers staring out silently with pale faces. A ship that refused to die. In more modern times, cruise ships have gathered their own legends of possession. In 1994, the Ocean Empress, a luxury liner, was reported by her captain as fighting back. Navigation systems flickered off one by one. The rudder turned against the wheel, resisting command. At night, the emergency lights blazed to life though no alarms had been triggered. Hallways filled with the sounds of footsteps when none were present, and cabin doors slammed shut in unison, as though by command. Passengers grew hysterical when elevators began moving on their own, carrying guests to the lowest decks and trapping them in silence. Some swore they heard the ship groaning, not the sound of stressed steel but something closer to a breath. Days later, the Ocean Empress ran aground in shallow water, tearing her hull open. Everyone survived, but the ship was declared beyond repair. In maritime yards, workers refused to dismantle her, claiming the lights inside flickered even when power was cut, and tools went missing only to reappear in impossible places. Eventually, the Empress was sold for scrap overseas, though whispers say sections of her hull were melted down and reused in new ships. If true, then her voice still sails today, but perhaps the most unnerving tales come from survivors themselves. In 2010, passengers aboard the Coral Horizon reported that their ship seemed to change direction during the night. The captain assured them it was weather-related, yet GPS records later showed the vessel steering toward empty ocean, away from its planned course without any mechanical explanation. Some travelers described the sensation of being watched, not by crew or cameras, but by the ship itself. One woman wrote in her journal that she awoke to find the cabin walls pulsing faintly, as though the steel itself were breathing. She never finished her journey. Her belongings were later found neatly folded on her bed, her journal still open on the deck. What remains is a horrifying question. Can a ship want? Can the steel remember screams? Can its decks absorb terror, until the whole vessel becomes a vessel not of joy, but of hunger? And if so, then perhaps some cruise ships do not merely carry passengers across the sea. Perhaps they carry them into themselves. There are certain vessels that never shake the aura of doom. Their hulls gleam with fresh paint, their cabins are furnished in velvet and gold, their chandeliers glow with promise, but beneath it all something stirs. The crew feel at first mechanical failures without cause, sudden silences in the engine room, doors that refuse to stay shut no matter how many times they're latched, and passengers feel it too. On the Mariner's Crown in 1988,
Guests reported the sound of music in the empty ballrooms, violins playing faintly though no performers were scheduled. The chandeliers trembled, though the air was still. One night the elevators moved in unison to the lowest deck, and remained there, doors gaping like mouths. Within hours the ship's generators failed. For nearly a full day she drifted powerless across the sea. When power returned, the ballroom mirrors had fractured, each one cracked down the center, as though reflecting a face no human eye could see. Others tell of the Aurora Star, a cruise liner that seemed cursed from launch. Her maiden voyage ended in disaster, when her navigation systems repeatedly steered her into storms, ignoring the captain's corrections. Crewmen swore the helm wheel resisted them, fighting against their grip like a living thing. In the dining hall silverware clattered without cause. In the engine room, tools were thrown from shelves as if by invisible hands. The Aurora Star eventually collided with another vessel in calm seas, an accident no one could explain. Survivors later said it felt as though the ship had chosen the collision, veering sharply at the last second toward the oncoming freighter. But the most terrifying account may come from the Emerald Dream, a modern liner lost only a decade ago. For weeks before its disappearance, passengers sent frantic emails home, complaining of doors that locked themselves from the outside, of portholes that fogged over with handprints pressed against the glass. Some claimed the intercom system whispered names late at night, names of passengers who had yet to vanish. When the Emerald Dream missed its scheduled docking, search teams scoured the ocean. No wreckage was ever found, no distress calls were sent. The ship, and the thousands aboard, simply disappeared. To this day there are reports of radar blips in the same waters, massive objects appearing and vanishing within minutes, as though a ship is still out there drifting unseen but not gone. What if ships themselves can change? What if, like the sea, they can develop hungers, moods, even malice? Steel is forged in fire, but it spends its life in water. Every screen within its hull, every death in its cabins, every drop of fear on its decks. What if these things linger? What if they seep into the very bones of the ship, until the vessel is no longer a machine, but a collector of souls? Sailors whisper of hungry ships, vessels that grow restless unless they are fed live. They malfunction when ignored, lure passengers into accidents, twist their captains into errors. Not haunted, but alive in their own way, predators clothed in steel and wood. Perhaps that is why certain ships seem to carry disaster with them, no matter who owns them, no matter where they sail, because they are not unlucky, they are not cursed, they are possessed, and possession does not fade. It is carried, from one voyage to the next, from one rebuild to another, which means, somewhere even now, a cruise ship may be silently watching its guests. Lights may flicker in amusement, its halls may tighten in hunger, and its engines may wait, patient and deliberate, until the time comes to choose its next sacrifice. Because sometimes the danger is not the sea, it is the ship beneath your feet. The ocean remembers every scream, every struggle, every final heartbeat that fades into its black depths. The sea collects them all, and ships, the vessels that carry us across it, become its archive. Each voyage is a page, written in salt water and fear, and some ships, it seems, are chosen to carry stories that should never be told. For centuries there have been accounts of vessels that do not complete their journey. They depart with music, with laughter, with champagne toasts on polished decks, but somewhere between departure and arrival they vanish. Some leave wreckage, some return empty, and some never return at all. This final story is not about a single ship. It is about a voyage that has been whispered about in maritime circles for decades, but never confirmed. Sailors call it the gathering of the lost, a phenomenon that defies maps, time and reason. It begins the same way every time. A cruise liner, bound for paradise, strays into fog that no forecast predicted. The passengers are calm at first, charmed even, as the ship cuts through a rolling curtain of white, but the fog thickens until the sun is gone. The stars are hidden, and day itself seems inside. The lights flicker, corridors stretch longer than they should, elevators stop at floors that don't exist, cabins breathe with unseen life, and the air tastes faintly of rust. Some say the fog is not weather, but a doorway, a threshold, a place where the ocean calls back the ships it has claimed, forcing the living to sail alongside the dead. Accounts from survivors, few and broken as they are, speak of seeing other liners in the mist, drifting silently beside their own ships that should have been rusted. Wrecks gleamed pristine, lanterns glowing, passengers frozen at the rails like statues. Some ships bore names known to history, long since sunk. Others carried markings never recorded, as if belonging to futures that had not yet happened. For hours, perhaps days, these ships sail together, bound in a phantom convoy. Time is lost, meals rot before they are touched. Music echoes from nowhere, blending with the groan of unseen hulls, and sometimes, voices call across the water, not cries for help, but invitation. It is in this fog that the living begin to disappear. A family at breakfast, gone between one blink and the next. A crewman vanishing on patrol, his footsteps simply stopping mid-haul. Passengers find cabins empty, luggage abandoned, journals half-written. And when the fog finally lifts, when the ship stumbles back into sunlight, into the ordinary sea, those who remain can never explain what happened. They simply know that dozens, sometimes hundreds, are gone. The cruise liner continues to its destination. Smiling staff serve shaken passengers. The orchestra plays again, and official reports later claim storms, equipment malfunctions, or human error. But the truth is whispered by the ones who have seen it. There is a place on the ocean where ships are called to join the dead, and if your vessel finds itself in that fog, you will never know if you are returning to shore, or if you have already set sail on your final voyage. The stories all begin the same way, but they do not all end alike. In some tellings the fog disperses, the ship reappears in familiar waters, and those aboard believe they have survived. But whispers among survivors reveal the truth. They did not return unchanged. Something came back with them. Dreams of saltwater shadows, unblinking eyes pressing against cabin windows, voices calling names in the dark. For months afterward, passengers vanish quietly in their own homes, as though the sea had marked them for later. Other times there is no return at all. The ship is last seen sailing steadily into mist, its engines calm, its decks full. Radio contact cuts without warning. No distress call is made. Families wait at docks that never see their loved ones disembark. Insurance papers are written, obituaries carved, but the ocean gives no answers, only silence. The darkest accounts claim that within the fog, ships begin to change. The hulls lengthen, decks shift into unfamiliar shape. Passengers wander through doors that lead to places no blueprint records, cabins where the air stinks, of brine ballrooms that echo with laughter from unseen guests, staircases that descend into black water. And among these changes, a realization creeps in. The ship they boarded no longer belongs to them. It belongs to the sea. It has become part of the convoy, one more vessel in the gathering of the lost, sailing alongside ghostly fleets that have no destination, only hunger. Sailors whisper that if you stand at the railing in that fog, and look long enough into the mist, you will see figures watching from the decks of other ships. Not passengers, not crew, but outlines thin, pale, faceless. They do not wave, they do not move, they simply wait. And if you look too long, you may find one standing suddenly beside you. Some survivors report seeing their own ship reflected in the fog, sailing parallel to itself, an impossible double crewed by shadows, each passenger mirrored but twisted, their faces slack, their eyes empty. It is said that when this happens the ship has a choice to return, or to stay, and those that stay are never heard from again. The final horror lies in what this gathering means. These ships are not accidents. They are not mysteries scattered randomly across time. They are harvests. The sea has always demanded sacrifice. Storms, shipwrecks, drownings, these were once enough. But with the rise of great vessels carrying thousands of souls at once, the ocean learned a darker appetite. It no longer waits for mistakes. It takes what it desires. Entire crews, entire ships, entire histories. Every year, more cruise liners set sail. More luxury voyages drift across waters that remember. And every year, some vanish, written off as storms, piracy, accidents. But the pattern grows clearer. They are being called to join the endless fleet of the lost. Somewhere beyond the fog, there sails a procession of ghost ships, sails and steel, old and new, drifting silently together in eternal darkness. Their passengers are neither living nor dead, but kept for reasons no human mind can fathom. And perhaps one day the fog will not return its prey at all. Perhaps one day, It will decide to expand, to roll outward, covering coasts, harbors, entire continents, until the gathering is no longer hidden at sea, but visible from every shore. If that day comes, the world will learn what sailors have always known, that the ocean is not water, it is hunger, that the ships we build are not safe havens, they are offerings, and that every voyage is only ever borrowed time, because sooner or later, every ship sails its final voyage.